The metal examination table was cold enough to feel through 2 layers of filthy wool. The American medic had not yet looked up from his supply cart. He was moving slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he has done the same task 1,000 times and no longer thinks about it. His rubber gloves made a soft snapping sound as he pulled them on. He reached for the dark brown glass bottle on the lower shelf of the cart. He unscrewed the black cap. He tilted the bottle forward. The liquid hit the open wound in a single steady stream. For exactly 1 second, nothing happened. Then the flesh began to bubble. Not gently, not slowly. The reaction was violent and immediate, a thick white foam erupting from the wound like something alive hissing softly as it consumed the dead tissue and the bacteria that had been feeding on this boy's leg for 3 weeks. A fine mist rose above the foam. The sound it made was low and wet and terrible. The 18-year-old on the table looked down at his own leg, and then he screamed. Not from pain, though pain was certainly there. He screamed because he believed with every neuron in his brain, every memory of every radio broadcast he had ever heard, every warning his officers had ever whispered to him in a frozen German forest, that the American medic had just poured acid onto his skin and was dissolving him alive. He kicked, hard. The metal supply cart went sideways and hit the canvas wall of the medical tent. Instruments scattered. 2 guards rushed in from the entrance flap, grabbing the boy by the shoulders, pressing him back against the table. He fought them with everything left in his exhausted body, which was not much, but enough. He twisted. He clawed at the foam on his leg with his bare hands, trying to wipe away what he believed was burning through his muscle and down to the bone. He was shouting in German over and over, the words breaking apart at the edges from the effort of screaming and crying at the same time. He was saying, "They are melting me. They are dissolving me. Please stop. Please stop." Dr. Thomas Garrett stood 2 steps back from the examination table, with his hands raised, palms out in the universal posture of a man who has just realized something far larger than a medical procedure is happening in front of him. He was 34 years old. He had treated hundreds of prisoners. He had seen men cry. He had seen men rage. He had seen men go silent and stiff with the particular variety of fear that comes from being completely in someone else's power. But he had never seen this. He had never seen a man genuinely believe that medicine was murder. He stood very still, and he looked at the boy on the table, at the way the boy's eyes moved between the foam on his leg and Garrett's face, searching for the confirmation of what the boy already believed to be true. And Garrett understood something in that moment that he would not fully be able to articulate for many years afterward. The wound on this boy's leg was not the problem. The wound in this boy's mind was the problem. And no amount of peroxide in the world was going to treat that one. To understand how a bottle of hydrogen peroxide became the most terrifying thing an 18-year-old German soldier had ever seen, you need to go back 6 months. You need to go back to a city that was not yet completely destroyed, to a boy who was not yet a soldier, to a radio that was on in the kitchen every single night of his life. The city of Aachen sits on the western edge of Germany, close to the Belgian and Dutch borders, in a region that has changed hands between great powers so many times over so many centuries that the people who live there have developed a particular relationship with the word permanent. Nothing is permanent. Every empire passes. Every army eventually goes home. In October 1944, Aachen became the first German city to fall to American forces. Street by street, building by building, the city was taken. German officers had ordered it held to the last man. The last man surrendered after 12 days. Felix Brauer did not witness the fall of Aachen directly. He and his mother, Hilda Brauer, a former primary school teacher, had been in the family cellar when the worst of it happened, listening to the sounds above them, holding each other in the dark. When they came up the street, looked like something from a dream about the end of the world. Felix was 18 years old, tall and thin, in the way of boys who have grown faster than their bodies can keep up with pale blonde hair, cut short at the neck, and the kind of serious face that old people sometimes call an old soul. His hands still had ink stains on the knuckles from a chemistry examination 2 weeks before his school closed permanently. He was not political. He was not a fanatic. He was not brave or reckless or filled with any particular ideology. He was a boy who liked chemistry and football and the novels of Stefan Zweig, and who had grown up in a country where the radio was always on, and the radio always told you what to think, and he had simply never had a reason to doubt it. That was his flaw. Not stupidity, not weakness. Something more ordinary and more dangerous than either of those things. He had never learned to question. 3 weeks after the fall of Aachen, a gray envelope was slipped through the mail slot of the Brauer apartment. Inside was a single page with an official stamp from the National Socialist Party. Felix Brauer was ordered to report to the local Volkssturm assembly point within 48 hours. The Volkssturm had been officially announced on October 18, 1944, by order of Adolf Hitler. It conscripted every male in Germany between the ages of 16 and 60 who was not already serving in the regular military. They were given minimal training, outdated weapons, and the ideological instruction that Germany would be defended to the last breath of its last citizen. Felix was 18. He had no choice. Refusal meant execution, and everyone knew it. The night before he was due to report, Felix sat at the kitchen table with his mother, while a cold November rain hit the blacked-out windows. She made chamomile tea from the last of the supplies she had been saving. She put it in front of him without speaking. Then she sat down across from him and put her hand over his hand and held it there. The radio was on in the corner. It was always on. The announcer's voice was the kind of voice designed to sound like absolute certainty, warm and deep and utterly convinced of everything it said. The voice described in careful detail what happened to German soldiers who surrendered to American forces. Special interrogation facilities, it said. Chemical methods, it said. Permanent physical destruction followed by forced labor until death. Felix listened. He listened the way a person listens to something they have heard so many times it has stopped being a statement and become a fact. The way you know that fire burns or that winter is cold. You do not think about it. It is simply the shape of the world. He looked at his mother's hand over his hand. He said, "Of course I will come back." She said, "Yes, of course you will." They both knew they were lying, but the lie was the only kindness either of them had left to offer the other. He reported the next morning. His unit was 60 men. Roughly a third of them were boys Felix's age or younger. The rest were men in their 40s and 50s who had somehow been passed over by earlier conscriptions, farmers and shopkeepers, and a retired postal worker who had volunteered in the Great War 30 years before and walked with a slight limp from a wound he had taken at the Somme. They were given 3 days of training. They were given rifles that had last been used by someone else. They were given a single lecture by a young officer who had himself been wounded twice and transferred to training duty, and who told them with absolute conviction that the German spirit was unconquerable, and that every man who died for the fatherland died for something eternal. Felix wrote down what the officer said in a small notebook. He was still at that point the kind of boy who took notes. 6 weeks later in the Rhineland near the Belgian border, his unit was ordered to hold a crossroads in a village so small it did not appear on most military maps. It was February 1945, the last bitter winter of a war that everyone except the men giving the orders already knew was finished. Their orders were to hold until relieved. Reinforcements were coming. No reinforcements came. Instead, at 4 in the morning, the world exploded. American artillery opened on their position from 3 directions simultaneously. The ground moved. Trees that had stood for a century snapped like kindling. The noise was not loud in any way that the word loud usually means. It was total. It replaced everything. It replaced thought and sound and the ability to remember that there had ever been a world that was quiet. Felix was in a shallow trench when the first shells landed. He pressed himself flat against the frozen earth and put his hands over his head, and he did not move. Around him, men were shouting. Some were running. Someone very close to him was making a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a prayer, something halfway between the two. He did not fire his rifle. He did not even pick it up. When he looked toward the shapes moving through the pre-dawn dark, he thought very clearly, they look like people. That thought terrified him more than the artillery did. An artillery shell detonated in the canopy directly above his position. The sound was like being inside a bell struck by something enormous. A piece of shrapnel the size of a man's hand tore through the frozen air and opened a long, deep gash in his left calf. The pain arrived about 2 seconds later. When it did, it was the kind of pain that empties the mind completely. There was nothing in the world except the burning, tearing sensation in his leg and a spreading warmth that he understood with the rational part of his brain that was still functioning was blood. He had no bandage, there were no medics. The trench was emptying as the surviving men ran. He tore a strip of cloth from the uniform of the man lying next to him, who was not going to need it anymore. He wrapped it around his leg. He tied it as tight as he could stand. He stood up, put his weight on it, felt the leg hold, and he ran. Half a mile into the forest, he stopped. An American soldier stood alone on the narrow frozen track between the trees. Young, probably 19 or 20, with a rifle leveled at Felix's chest. The rifle did not waver. The two of them looked at each other across maybe 20 feet of frozen air. Felix's hands were empty. He had dropped his rifle somewhere back in the chaos. The cloth around his leg was already dark and wet. He could feel his heartbeat in the wound, a slow, terrible pulse. The American soldier looked at Felix's hands, looked at his leg, looked at his face. Then he slowly lowered the barrel of his rifle. He jerked his head backward toward the direction he had come from. "Come with me." Felix raised his hands over his head. His heart was hammering against his ribs. In his chest, a voice that sounded exactly like the radio announcer from his mother's kitchen said, "Special interrogation facilities, chemical methods, permanent physical destruction." He thought, this is how it begins. He was wrong. But he would not know that for months. The days that followed were a kind of slow erasure. The holding pen near the coast of France, the transport ship, the dark hold packed with thousands of German soldiers, the air thick with diesel, and the particular smell of men who have been afraid for a very long time. The endless crossing of the Atlantic in a narrow canvas bunk while his leg pulsed with the deep interior heat of infection. He hid the wound. He hid it deliberately, obsessively, with the full conviction that exposure meant death in a form he had been carefully taught to imagine. When guards walked the hold, he lay still. When other prisoners asked if he was all right, he said yes. When the fever came, he pressed his forehead against the cold metal wall of the ship and counted backward from 100 and told himself he was fine. He was not fine. The cloth bandage had stiffened with dried blood and pus. The skin around the wound had turned a color that he tried not to look at too directly. There was a smell that he told himself he was imagining. He was not imagining it. By the time the transport ship docked in New York Harbor and the prisoners were loaded onto trains heading inland, Felix could barely walk. He leaned on the man beside him, an older soldier named Ernst from Hamburg, and Ernst held him up without comment in the particular way that exhausted men help each other when words have become too expensive. The train brought them to Camp Hearn in Robertson County, Texas. The camp was enormous. Long wooden barracks behind tall wire fences and guard towers. The sun was blinding after the dark of the hold. The air smelled of dust and grass and something faintly sweet that Felix would later identify as the pecan orchards that surrounded the camp on three sides. They were lined up for processing. Medical inspection was mandatory for every prisoner. Each man was required to pass through the intake tent before being assigned to a barracks. There were no exceptions and there were no shortcuts, which meant that what Felix had been dreading since the artillery strike in the Rhineland was now approximately 40 men away. Ernst leaned close as the line moved forward and said very quietly, "Your leg smells, Junge. Everyone can tell." Felix looked at the line ahead of him, looked at the medical tent at the far end of the processing area, looked down at his leg. He thought about the chemical methods, about the special facilities, about everything the radio had told him was waiting on the other side of that tent flap. He thought about his mother's hand over his hand. He thought, if I say nothing, maybe they will not notice. Maybe I can get through this without them knowing. Maybe I can endure whatever comes after the examination is done before anyone sees the wound. Maybe. The line moved forward. The tent got closer. Felix Brauer, 18 years old, former chemistry student, former boy who liked football and novels, in the quiet of a kitchen with his mother, walked toward the thing he was most afraid of in the world, and tried very hard to walk without limping. He did not entirely succeed. The American medic at the inspection table noticed immediately. He said something in English to the guard beside him. The guard stepped forward and took Felix's arm, not roughly, not kindly, simply with the firm purposefulness of someone completing a procedure. They brought him to a separate tent. They lifted him onto a metal examination table, and Dr. Thomas Garrett, who had been on duty for 11 hours and had more patients to see before he could sleep, walked in and began, for what he thought was just another time that day, to treat an infected wound. He did not know what was about to happen. Neither did Felix. But the dark brown glass bottle was already sitting on the supply cart, and the moment was already coming moving toward them both the way certain moments do, carrying everything that had happened before it and everything that would come after, carrying the German radio in the kitchen and the artillery in the Rhineland and a dead lieutenant at Monte Cassino and a strip of cloth torn from a dead man's uniform, carrying all of it forward through the cold Texas air toward the instant when a medic would open a bottle of hydrogen peroxide and a boy would believe with complete and absolute certainty that he was being dissolved alive. Garrett reached for the bottle. Felix closed his eyes. The liquid poured. The foam was still hissing when the room went silent. Not completely silent. There was still the sound of Felix's ragged breathing, still the low scrape of the overturned supply cart against the canvas floor, still the muffled voices of other prisoners somewhere outside the tent. But the screaming had stopped. The thrashing had stopped. The two guards had Felix pinned to the examination table, one hand on each shoulder, and Felix had gone from violent to rigid, which is a different thing entirely. Rigid means the body has run out of energy for fighting and has shifted into something older and more desperate. Rigid means waiting to see if you are going to survive the next 30 seconds. Garrett stood 2 feet away with the brown glass bottle still in his hand. He was looking at the boy's face, not at the wound, not at the foam which was already beginning to subside, already doing the work it was designed to do, breaking down the dead tissue in the bacterial colonies that had been growing in Felix's leg for 3 weeks. He was looking at the boy's face because the boy's face was the most important piece of medical information in the room. What he saw there was not rage, not hatred, not the sullen defiance he sometimes encountered from prisoners who had been convinced by their officers that cooperation was a form of surrender. What he saw was the raw, uncomplicated terror of someone who genuinely believed they were about to die in a particularly terrible way. The boy's eyes were fixed on his own leg with the expression of a person watching something irreversible happen. His lips were moving slightly, not forming words anyone could hear, just moving. Garrett had treated soldiers before. He had treated men who had lost limbs and men who had lost friends and men who had lost whatever it was inside a person that allows them to believe the world is worth continuing in. He understood suffering in its many forms. But this particular form, a healthy mind destroyed not by what had happened to its owner, but by what that mind had been carefully taught to believe would happen, this was something he had not encountered before in quite this way. This was not injury. This was architecture. Someone had built something inside this boy's skull, brick by brick, over months or years, and what Garrett was looking at was the result. He set the bottle down on the edge of the examination table. He looked at the guards and gave them a small nod, the kind of nod that means hold him but do not hurt him. Then he looked around the room until he found what he needed. A camp interpreter was standing near the tent entrance, an older man named Kurt Weber, who had been born in Frankfurt and had lived in Texas for 35 years, and who still carried both languages in his head with equal fluency. Weber had come in at the sound of the screaming. He was watching everything with the careful stillness of someone who has learned through long experience to observe before speaking. Garrett looked at Weber. Weber nodded and moved forward, speaking in German, his voice low and even, explaining in slow, careful words what hydrogen peroxide was, what it did, why the bubbling was not destruction, but the opposite of destruction. Felix shook his head, hard. He was not hearing the words. The words were going in, but hitting something solid before they could reach any part of his mind that could process them as true. He kept looking at the foam, which was now subsiding to a thin white residue at the edges of the wound, and then looking at Garrett, and then back at the foam as if the comparison might eventually produce a different result. Weber looked at Garrett and spread his hand slightly. The gesture meant words are not working. We need something else, Garrett understood. He picked up the brown glass bottle from the table edge. He looked directly at Felix. He wanted to make absolutely certain the boy was watching. The boy was watching. His eyes were wide and the pupils were very large in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting in the tent. Garrett pulled back the sleeve of his left arm to the elbow. He turned his forearm over so the inner surface faced upward. He held it out toward Felix, steady close enough that the boy could see every detail of the skin. Then he tilted the bottle and poured. The liquid ran across his forearm in a clear, thin stream. It caught the light, briefly transparent and unremarkable. It ran down toward his wrist and dripped from the edge of his hand onto the canvas floor. No foam, no hiss, no vapor, No dissolving. His skin remained exactly as it had been. A 34-year-old doctor's forearm with a faded scar near the wrist from a childhood accident and a light tan that stopped at the shirt line. He held it there. He did not speak. He did not look away from Felix's face. He simply held his arm out and let the evidence be what it was. The silence in the tent lasted approximately 10 seconds. It felt much longer. Felix's eyes moved from Garrett's arm to his own leg and back to Garrett's arm. He did this 3 times. The 4th time his eyes completed the trip, they stayed on Garrett's arm a little longer than before. Something was happening behind them. Some slow and painful recalculation. The kind that costs more than most things cost, because it requires a person to acknowledge that a significant portion of what they believed to be true was not true, and that the gap between what they believed and what was real had nearly killed them. The rigidity in Felix's body began to change, not to relaxation, to something more complicated than relaxation. The guards felt it in his shoulders and loosened their grip slightly without being asked. Felix's hands, which had been balled into fists, opened slowly at his sides. He stared at Garrett's arm for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes. When he opened them, there were still tears on his face from the screaming, but something in his expression had shifted. The terror was still present. It does not leave that quickly, terror that has been installed over months of careful repetition. But there was now a thin line of something running alongside it, some tentative, fragile, unformed thing that had not been there 60 seconds earlier, the beginning of a question. Garrett lowered his arm. He picked up a clean cloth and dried it carefully. He looked at Weber and said, "Tell him the foam is what the medicine looks like when it is working. Tell him it only reacts with infection. Tell him his leg is going to be all right." Weber translated. Felix listened. His eyes moved from Weber's face to Garrett's face and back. He did not say anything. Garrett returned to the wound. He worked carefully and quietly, cleaning the damaged tissue, removing what could not be saved, packing the wound with sulfa powder, bandaging it in layers of clean gauze. Felix lay still through all of it. His breathing slowed. The fever was still clearly present, the particular sheen of a man whose body has been fighting for weeks and is beginning to lose. But he did not fight. He did not flinch more than the pain required. He stared at the ceiling of the medical tent, and he let himself be treated. When Garrett was finished, he said something to Weber. Weber translated. He said, "You need to rest now. You are safe here." Felix looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head and looked at Garrett. His expression was unreadable in the way of people who have not yet found a language for what they are feeling. He said nothing. He did not nod. But he did not shake his head either. Garrett left the tent. He walked back to his small office at the edge of the medical compound, sat down at his desk, and stared at the wall for a while. Outside the canvas walls, Camp Hearn continued as it always did, the routines and sounds of a facility holding nearly 5,000 men, voices in German boots on packed dirt, the distant clang of the mess hall being prepared for evening. Ordinary sounds. He had stopped hearing them months ago. Now he heard them again. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. There was a photograph there that he kept face down. He had put it face down on a Tuesday in June 1944, the day he received the telegram from him about his brother David, and he had not turned it back over since. He did not turn it over now, but he left his hand resting on the back of it for a moment. David had been 26, a lieutenant in the infantry, killed at Monte Cassino, Italy in May 1944, which was several weeks before the Allied forces finally took the mountain and the monastery that had been costing so many lives for so many months. He had died taking ground that was taken anyway. Garrett was not sure what to do with that information. He had been not sure about it for 9 months, and he was no closer to resolution. What he knew was that there was a specific person in the world who had shot his brother. That person was German. Beyond that, nothing. The person might be dead. The person might be in a camp somewhere in England. The person might, in some version of the world that turned out to be exactly the wrong one, be in this camp in Texas, eating dinner in the mess hall 200 yards from where Garrett was sitting. He knew what he was supposed to feel about that. He had spent 9 months feeling it, or something like it, with varying degrees of success. Some days it came easily, that particular cold dislike that required no maintenance, that simply sat in his chest like an object. Some days it required effort. Today, for the first time in 9 months, it had required considerable effort. Because the boy on the examination table was 18 years old and had never chosen anything about the situation he was in. He had not chosen to be born in Germany. He had not chosen the radio in his kitchen. He had not chosen the propaganda that had been layered into him year by year until it was indistinguishable from his own beliefs. He had not chosen the gray envelope that appeared in his mail slot, or the rifle that was thrust into his hands, or the frozen road where a piece of metal had torn open his leg. He had chosen to hide the wound rather than seek treatment. That much was true. But Garrett had just spent 20 minutes in a room with that choice, and he understood its logic completely. The boy had hidden the wound because he believed with his entire mind that seeking treatment was the same thing as seeking death. He had endured 3 weeks of infection rather than risk what he had been absolutely certain was waiting for him on the other side of that examination tent. That was not the behavior of a fanatic. That was not hatred. That was a person trapped inside a story that someone else had written for him, unable to see the walls of the story because he had never been outside it. Garrett sat at his desk for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and wrote 4 words on a small piece of paper. He folded it twice and wrote Felix Brauer on the outside in the barracks number of the recovery ward. He walked to the door of his office and handed it to the orderly on duty and told him to have it delivered. The note said in German, rendered imperfectly through the small German dictionary Garrett kept in his desk for basic patient communication. "Your leg will be fine." He signed it with his last name only. He went back to his desk and picked up the next patient file. He did not think about the note again, or so he told himself. 3 days passed. Felix spent most of those 3 days horizontal, drifting in and out of the particular blurred consciousness of someone whose body is using every available resource to fight an infection. The fever peaked on the second night and broke toward morning of the third day. He woke to find the light in the recovery ward different, softer. The early light of a Texas morning coming through canvas that was thin enough to glow, and he was aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that he was cold in the normal way of a person who has been sweating heavily and is now dry. The second was that his leg did not hurt in the deep interior way it had been hurting for 3 weeks. It still hurt, but differently. The difference between the pain of a fire that is still burning and the pain of a fire that has been put out. The structure of the pain had changed. He lay still for a while and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the arm. He had thought about it on and off through the fever, though most of those thoughts had been formless and could not be trusted. Now clear-headed for the first time in weeks, he thought about it with the methodical attention he used to give to chemistry problems. He laid out what he knew. He laid it out carefully the way his teacher had once told him to do, with any problem that resisted easy solutions. Start with what you know for certain. Work outward from there. He knew that the liquid had done something to his wound that it had not done to the doctor's arm. He knew that the difference between his wound and the doctor's arm was the infection. He knew that his wound was better than it had been, not worse. He thought about the radio. He thought about the exact words the announcer had used. Chemical methods to destroy tissue. He thought about what he had seen with his own eyes. He thought about what he knew about hydrogen peroxide from his chemistry class, the molecular structure, the oxygen release, the oxidation reaction. He thought chemistry does not lie. He thought the radio lied. Then he stopped thinking it because it was too large. Because if the radio had lied about this, then the radio might have lied about other things. And if the radio had lied about other things, then the shape of the world he thought he lived in was wrong, in ways he did not yet have the capacity to measure. And that was not a thought a person could have all at once without something breaking. He set it aside, not dismissed, set aside to be returned to when he had more strength. He reached under his thin mattress and found the folded piece of paper that the orderly had brought him on the first day. He unfolded it. "Your leg will be fine." Garrett, the German, was imperfect. The handwriting was small and careful. The handwriting of someone who does not write in German often, but who wanted to get it right. Nobody had asked Garrett to write it. Weber had not mentioned it. There was no record of it anywhere, no official notation in any file. It was simply a thing the doctor had done because he had wanted to do it. Felix held the paper for a moment and said nothing because there was no one to say anything to, and because sometimes the most important thoughts have no immediate destination. On the 4th day, he had a visitor. The man came in the mid-morning when the recovery ward was quiet. He was 35 with the kind of face that people sometimes describe as honest before they understand that honesty is not a feature of a face. He sat down in the chair beside Felix's bed and looked around the ward with the unhurried attention of someone who is not worried about being watched. Then he looked at Felix and he smiled, and the smile was warm, and his voice when he spoke was the most familiar thing Felix had heard since leaving Germany. His name, he said, was Hans Moeller. He was a former non-commissioned officer. He had heard about the incident in the examination tent. He leaned forward and spoke very quietly. He said that the food was a strategy. The medical care was a strategy. All of it was designed to make prisoners feel safe, to lower their defenses, to extract information. The Americans were not kind. Kindness did not exist between enemies. What existed was calculation, and what they were calculating was how to use the men in this camp before sending them home to a destroyed country. Felix listened. He felt the words landing in him, felt them finding the places where the old patterns lived, the grooves worn into his thinking by years of the same voice, saying the same things. The words fit. They were designed to fit. They were shaped perfectly for the space they were trying to occupy. But there was something else in the space now, something small and stubborn that had not been there before. The image of a doctor's forearm, clear liquid running across undamaged skin. No foam, no hiss, no dissolving. Muller finished speaking and looked at Felix with an expression of warm patience, the expression of a man who considers himself to be offering a gift. He said, "I need you to do something for me. You are here in the recovery ward. You see things, hear things. The guards speak near you. The doctors speak near you. I need you to listen and report back to me what you observe." Felix looked at him. He thought about Hugo Kraus, whose name he had learned from other prisoners on the transport ship, the camp interpreter who had cooperated with the Americans and been beaten to death by 7 men in the night. He knew what happened to people who refused men like Mahler. He knew what happened to people who were seen to refuse. He said, "I will think about it." Mahler nodded. He stood up. He straightened his jacket with the small, automatic gesture of a man who has spent his life in uniform. He left the ward without looking back. Felix stared at the ceiling. He lay there for a long time, not moving, while outside the recovery tent, the sounds of Camp Hearn continued. Voices, boots, the distant clanging of the kitchen. The particular quiet of an enormous number of people living in close quarters, which is always both loud and somehow deeply still underneath the loudness. In his mind, he placed two things beside each other. On one side, Mahler's words, which fit the grooves, which sounded like every true thing he had ever been told. On the other side, a forearm, clear liquid, no foam, and 4 imperfectly written German words from a man who had no reason to write them. He did not know it yet, but he was doing something he had never been taught to do. He was comparing. He was setting evidence against assertion. He was asking for the first time in his life not what he had been told to believe, but what he had actually gained. It was slow. It was uncomfortable. It felt like trying to move furniture in a room that had been arranged the same way for 18 years. But it was happening. He thought Mahler's explanation requires that the note is a trick. It requires that a man who has 100 patients and 11-hour shifts in a ward to manage took time to look up German words in order to construct a deception aimed at a single 18-year-old prisoner in the recovery ward. It was possible. He supposed it was possible, but the chemistry did not support it. The next morning when Garrett came on his rounds, Felix sat up in bed. He waited until Garrett was close. Then he looked directly at the doctor, and in German, slowly and clearly, he said, "There is someone watching you. There is someone watching me. And I think you should know about it." Garrett did not understand the words, but he understood the face. He had been a doctor for 8 years. He had learned that faces carry information, that words sometimes obscure, that the body reveals what the mouth is trained to conceal. Felix's face was not the face of a man performing. It was not the face of a man calculating an angle. It was the face of someone who has made a decision that frightens them and is following through on it anyway, which is one of the clearest expressions of courage that exists, and one of the most recognizable because it looks nothing like confidence and everything like fear moving forward in spite of itself. Garrett held the boy's gaze. Then he went to the entrance of the ward and found Weber, who was outside in the morning light drinking coffee, and he brought him back in and said, "Please, ask him what he means." Weber asked. Felix told them everything. Weber spoke for 20 minutes inside the recovery ward, translating for Garrett, with his hands folded in his lap and his voice very low. He did not just translate the surface of what Felix had said, not just the names and the dates and the operational details of what Mahler had been building inside the camp. He translated the texture of it, the way Felix had described Mahler's visits, the warmth in Mahler's voice, the way the words had fit so perfectly into the spaces that had been prepared for them over years of the same kind of voice saying the same kind of thing. Garrett listened without interrupting. When Weber finished, there was a silence in the recovery ward. Two other prisoners were asleep in beds at the far end. A fly moved in slow circles near the tent entrance. Garrett said, "He knows what could happen to him for telling us this." Weber said, "Yes, he knows." Garrett said, "Does he understand that we will need to move quickly and that his name cannot be part of any official record of how we learned about this?" Weber said, "He already asked for that, before I asked on your behalf." Garrett looked at Felix, who was watching the conversation with the careful attention of someone following the emotional content of words he cannot fully understand, tracking tone and expression the way a person tracks weather when they have no instrument to measure it directly. Felix met his eyes. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing in the professional literature of military medicine that covered this particular moment. There was no protocol for what it meant when a prisoner who had arrived believing you were going to dissolve him alive sat up in a recovery ward bed and handed you information that put himself in danger because he had apparently decided on the evidence of a forearm and a small piece of badly written German that you could be trusted. Garrett nodded once. Felix nodded once. That was the entirety of Lasit. Garrett went directly from the recovery ward to Captain Warren Simmons's office and closed the door behind him. Simmons listened to everything without expression. He was a compact, careful man who had lost his son at Guadalcanal in 1942 and who had subsequently developed an administrative precision that functioned as both professional virtue and personal armor. He did not ask how Garrett had obtained the information. He did not ask about the source. He simply picked up his pen and began to write. Then he set the pen down and looked at Garrett. He said, "I am going to deal with this. And when I am done dealing with it, I am going to need you to step back from this prisoner. Reassignment to the American ward. New rotation starting next week." Garrett said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is that necessary?" Simmons said, "I think you already know the answer to that. What you did in that examination tent was not wrong. But what comes next cannot become something personal between a doctor and a prisoner. You understand what I mean." Garrett understood. He did not like it, but he understood. 3 days later, Hans Mahler and 4 men connected to his network were transferred to a segregation camp in Oklahoma, which is what the Army called the facilities designed to hold prisoners who had demonstrated through action or ideology that they could not safely share space with men who were attempting to leave the war behind them. The process was quiet. No announcement, no confrontation. Mahler was simply gone one morning, and the men in his orbit were gone with him, and the particular atmospheric pressure that his presence had created in the barracks settled into something different. Not exactly peace, but the absence of a specific kind of threat, which in a confined space full of exhausted men sometimes feels indistinguishable from peace. Before he left, Mahler had passed a message through the remaining door. The 18-year-old in the recovery ward had talked. Felix received this information third-hand from a man who told him not as a threat but as a warning, an older prisoner from Frankfurt who had no loyalty to Mahler and some residual human instinct toward decency that the war had not entirely erased. The man told Felix quietly one evening and then walked away and never mentioned it again. Felix lay in his bed that night and considered what he had done. He was not sorry. That surprised him somewhat, the absence of regret. He had expected to feel something complicated. What he felt instead was a very simple exhaustion, the kind that follows a long effort rather than a defeat. He had carried something heavy for a long time, and now he had set it down, and the setting down had cost him something, and the cost was real, but the weight was gone. He fell asleep before he had finished thinking about it. 6 weeks later, he was discharged from the recovery ward. His leg carried a scar. Long and pale pink and slightly raised along its upper edge, it ran diagonally across the outer surface of his left calf in a way that would be visible for the rest of his life every time he wore short trousers or rolled up his pants in summer. He had looked at it for the first time without a bandage on a quiet Wednesday morning, standing in the small washroom adjacent to the recovery ward, and he had looked at it for a long time. He thought this is where the radio ended. Then he got dressed and walked out into the Texas morning. Camp Hearn in the spring of 1945 was a different world from Camp Hearn in the winter. The light was different. The air was different. The pecan trees beyond the wire had come into leaf, and the mockingbirds that lived in them were constant and elaborate in their singing. The sky above Robertson County, Texas was a color of blue that Felix had no German word for, a wide, pale, luminous blue that went on in every direction to the edge of everything with nothing to interrupt it. No mountains, no tall buildings, no ruins. Just sky. He had grown up in a city. He had never seen this much sky in his life. He stood in the yard of his assigned barracks on his first morning back in the general population and tipped his head back and looked at it for a while. A man named Georg, a former school teacher from Heidelberg, who had been conscripted at 42 and captured at 43, and who spent most of his free time in camp, reading anything the library would provide, came to stand beside him and also looked up. Georg said, "It does not look like war sky." Felix said, "No." Georg said, "I have been here 11 months and I still look at it every morning." They stood there together for a moment. Then they went in for breakfast. The daily life of this camp was not what Felix had expected in any particular. The food was adequate. The barracks were crowded but not cruel. The work details took them outside the wire to surrounding farms, where they picked crops in the warm Texas air and were sometimes given extra food by the farm families, bread or fruit left in baskets near the worksite, an act of ordinary human generosity that each time it happened, Felix received with a confusion he could not entirely resolve. He was the enemy. He was also being given an apple by someone's grandmother. He began very quietly and very privately to write things down. Not in a notebook, in the margins of a German language Bible that the camp library provided to prisoners who requested it. Small observations, not prayers, not ideology, just things he had seen that he wanted to remember. The foam means the medicine is working. An apple from someone's grandmother. The sky here has no edges. He was reassigned to a work detail in late March, a group that spent 3 days a week at a pecan processing facility 8 miles from the camp. The facility was run by a family named Calloway, and the oldest son, a man of about 50, who had been unable to serve due to a heart condition, sometimes sat near the prisoner work crew at the lunch break and talked without any particular agenda. He spoke no German. Felix spoke almost no English. They communicated through gesture and expression and a shared willingness to sit in the same place at the same time, which is not nothing. It is in fact the foundation of almost everything. The man's name was Earl. One afternoon in April, Earl brought 2 bottles of Coca-Cola to the lunch break and handed one to Felix without comment. Felix had never had Coca-Cola. He drank it slowly, trying to understand it, the sweetness and the bite of it, the carbonation strange against the back of his throat. Earl watched him figure it out and laughed a short, friendly laugh, and with no cruelty in it, and Felix found himself laughing too. And for approximately 45 seconds in a pecan processing facility in Robertson County, Texas, neither of them was anything except 2 men who had found something briefly and unexpectedly funny. Felix thought about that moment for days afterward. He thought, I am being changed here, not by what I expected to change me, not by force or by argument or by instruction. I am being changed by details, by a forearm and a note and a scar and an apple from a stranger and a bottle of Coca-Cola and a sky that goes on forever, by the accumulated weight of small true things. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The news reached Camp Hearn in the evening after dinner and moved through the barracks in a way that Felix would later describe as less like an announcement and more like a tide, a slow, inevitable incoming thing that everyone had been watching approach for months, and that still when it arrived felt different from what they had imagined. Some men wept, some sat very still, some talked loudly about going home. Some said nothing at all and went to their bunks and lay down facing the wall. Felix sat on the edge of his bunk and thought about his mother in Aachen. He thought the war is over. I have survived. These 2 facts are true simultaneously, and I do not yet know what to do with either of them. He thought about what he would say to her when he saw her, what words existed for what he had learned in the past 3 months. He tried to construct a sentence in his head, tried to find a way to begin, and found that every beginning he could locate was too small for what it needed to carry. He fell asleep before he found the right words. 2 days later, a folded piece of paper appeared under his bunk during the work rotation, slipped there by Weber, who said only that it had come through official channels and that it was from someone who had requested that it be delivered privately. Felix unfolded it. The German was better than the first note. Someone had taken more time with it, or had access to a better dictionary, or had asked Weber for help. The handwriting was the same. Small and careful, not a natural writer's hand, but a deliberate one, the hand of someone who was paying attention to each letter. It said, Brower, what you did required more courage than anything I have done in a long time. I lost my brother David in Italy in May of last year. I did not know who he faced at the end. I know it was not you. What you chose in that war to tell the truth when the easier thing was silence is something David would have done in your position. I hope your leg continues to heal. I hope you find your way home. Garrett. Felix read it 3 times. Then he folded it very carefully along the original creases and put it inside the Bible with the margins full of small observations. He put the Bible in the bottom of his kit bag. He closed the kit bag. He sat on his bunk for a while with his hands resting on his knees. He thought about a man he had never properly spoken to, a man who had poured a liquid on his own arm to show a terrified boy that the world was not what the boy had been told it was. A man who had done this while carrying his own private weight, a brother dead in Italy, an enemy face attached to no name, a grief that had no object and therefore no resolution. He thought we were both trapped inside something someone else built. He was trapped inside his grief the same way I was trapped inside my fear. And we got out of the same room at the same time through the same door, which was the door of what is actually true. He did not see Garrett again before the repatriation process began. He had wanted to. He had asked Weber to arrange it. Weber had explained gently that Garrett had been reassigned to the American ward by order of Captain Simmons, a decision made with what Simmons would have called operational necessity, and what Weber suspected was something more complicated, a man protecting a doctor from a connection that had already gone beyond the careful boundaries that Simmons believed should exist between captors and captives. Felix accepted in this. He wrote one last entry in the Bible margin. He wrote, "Some distances cannot be crossed during a war, but the war will end." He closed the Bible. In October 1945, the repatriation transport left from a port in New Jersey. Felix stood on the upper deck as the American coastline disappeared behind them, which is the opposite of what he had done on the crossing coming in when he had been in the hold feverish and hidden, waiting to arrive at the place where he expected to be destroyed. He stood in the open air and watched the country he had feared become smaller, and then become nothing, and then become memory. He had a scar on his leg, a Bible with writing in the margins, 2 folded notes from a man named Garrett, and something else harder to name that he carried not in his kit bag, but somewhere in the region of his chest, the particular weight of a world that has turned out to be more complicated and more forgiving than the one you were given to inhabit as a child. Germany in the autumn of 1945 was not a country. It was the idea of one buried under rubble. Aachen had been damaged more severely than Felix had allowed himself to imagine during his months in Texas. He navigated streets he had walked his entire life by memory and landmark and found that the landmarks were gone. He asked directions from a woman sitting on a pile of bricks who looked at him with the expression of someone for whom the concept of directions had temporarily lost its meaning. He found his mother on the 3rd day. She was living with a neighbor 2 streets from their original apartment building, which no longer had a roof. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair had gone gray at the temples in a way it had not been when he left. When she opened the door and saw him, she made a sound that was not a word, but that he understood completely. And then she had both arms around him and her face pressed against his shoulder, and neither of them moved for a long time. Later, over the first real meal they had shared in nearly a year, thin soup and bread that was not quite enough but was real and warm, and on a table in a room with walls, she asked him what it had been like. He told her about the examination tent. He told her about the foam and the screaming and the 2 guards holding his shoulders in the absolute certainty he had felt that he was dying. He told her about the doctor who had poured the liquid onto his own arm. He told her about the scar and showed her rolling up his trouser leg in his mother's borrowed kitchen. She looked at the scar for a long time. She touched it very gently with 2 fingers in the way of a person confirming that something real exists. She said, The radio said they would hurt you. He said yes. She said, but they did not. He said, no, they did not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what do we do now with all the things we were told? He said, I think we go through them slowly, one at a time. And we ask, what did I see with my own eyes? What did I hear with my own ears? What do I know to be true because I was there? She nodded. Then she poured more soup into his bowl, and they ate. And outside the borrowed window, the broken city continued its slow process of deciding whether to give up or begin again, which it had been doing for several months and would continue to do for several years, and which it would eventually resolve, as most things do, in the direction of beginning again. The years passed. Felix studied chemistry at the University of Aachen under a post-war reconstruction program funded by American relief efforts, which struck him as the kind of detail that a person with a sense of irony might appreciate, and which he in fact did appreciate quietly and privately in the way he appreciated most things. He graduated in 1950. He married a woman named Anna in 1952, a former nurse who had her own complicated relationship with the recent past, and who recognized in Felix the particular quality of someone who has come through something and come out changed rather than destroyed, which she considered a prerequisite for the life she intended to build. He went to work for a medical supply company in Stuttgart in 1954. By 1962, he was running a small manufacturing division that produced sterile wound care products, including, among other things, hydrogen peroxide solution in dark brown glass bottles. He did not find this remarkable, or rather, he found it remarkable every day and said nothing about it to his colleagues because there are some things that belong to the interior of a life and resist translation into the language of the ordinary working day. He thought of Garrett often, not obsessively, not with the heavy formless longing of unfinished business, but with the steady recurring frequency of a thought that has found its proper place in a person's architecture and visits regularly the way certain rooms in a house are used every day without being considered remarkable until you consider them. In 1962, through the German Red Cross and a chain of correspondence that required 18 months and considerable patience, he obtained an address, a medical practice in Nashville, Tennessee, a name on a door. He wrote a letter. He did not hear back for 4 months. Then a letter arrived written in English, which Felix by that point could read adequately if slowly. It was short. It said, I was not certain you would want to hear from me. I am glad you did. I think about the tent sometimes. David would have been 44 this year. I hope Germany is finding its way. Write again if you wish. He wrote again. They wrote to each other for 23 years, not frequently, not with the regularity of close friends who have nothing to prove to each other. More like the correspondence of two people who understand that what they share is too specific for ordinary friendship and too real for anything less. They wrote when something happened that seemed to belong to the conversation they had been having since a February morning in Texas. Felix wrote when his son was born. He wrote when Anna was ill, and then when she recovered. He wrote when he stood in a rebuilt Aachen for the first time and tried to find the street where he had grown up, and found it and stood on it for a long time. Garrett wrote when he retired. He wrote when he went back to look at the site of Camp Hearn, which by 1980 had been absorbed back into the Texas landscape with only a historical marker to note what had happened there. He wrote, I stood there for a while and thought about a supply cart going sideways and hitting a tent wall. It seemed worth remembering. Felix wrote back, I think about the arm. I have thought about it most days for 35 years. In September 1985, Felix Brauer drove a rented car from Nashville Airport to a house in a quiet neighborhood of mature trees and wide porches. He had his wife Anna beside him and his son Thomas, who was 25 and studying medicine in Frankfurt, and who had been told the story of the tent in the way of a family story told so many times over so many years that it had become part of the architecture of how Thomas understood the world to work. They parked in front of the house. Garrett was on the porch. He was 74 years old, still upright, still carrying himself with the careful economy of someone who had spent decades in a profession that required physical reliability. His hair was fully white. His face had the particular texture of a man who had spent time in a sunny climate. He was watching the car as they got out, watching with an expression that Felix recognized immediately because he had felt it himself for the entire flight from Frankfurt, the expression of someone who has been waiting to complete something for a very long time and is now one moment away from doing so, and is not entirely certain how to arrive at the moment. They stood in the driveway and looked at each other. 40 years since the tent. 40 years since a supply cart going sideways. 40 years since a forearm held out over a medical table in a Texas February. Felix opened his bag. He took out a small, dark brown glass bottle. The label was in German. The contents were clear. He had brought it from his own facility in Stuttgart, a sample of the product his division produced packed carefully in the center of his luggage on the transatlantic flight, as if it were something fragile, which in every sense that mattered, it was. He held it out to Garrett. Garrett looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. He held it up slightly, turning it in the light. The liquid caught the afternoon sun and went briefly golden before settling back to clear. He said, "You make this now," Felix said. "Part of why I make this?" "Yes." Garrett looked at him. His expression was the same expression Felix had seen in the tent 40 years ago in the moment after the arm. In the moment when the push on the examination table had stopped thrashing and begun to think. The expression of a person encountering evidence and choosing to let it mean something. He said, "Come inside. I have a great deal of things to tell you about David." They went inside. Anna sat with Garrett's wife Margaret in the kitchen where Margaret had made coffee and a pound cake, and where the conversation between two women who share the experience of loving men, shaped by the same specific afternoon, moved into its own territory with a naturalness that required no translation. Thomas sat with the two older men in the living room and listened to them talk. His German and Garrett's English overlapped and filled in each other's gaps. He listened to the story of the tent as he had never heard it before, which is to say from both sides simultaneously, each man completing the other's account of the same 60 seconds, the foam and the arm, and the silence after. At one point, Garrett rose and went to a drawer in the sideboard and came back with two pieces of paper folded, and old the creases soft with handling. He placed them on the table. Felix recognized them immediately, his own handwriting on both. Letters from Stuttgart from the early years of the correspondence. Felix reached into his jacket and took out the Bible. He had carried it with him from Texas to Germany, to 40 years of a life, its cover worn to the color of old wood, its pages marked in the margins, with small, careful observations in faded pencil. He opened it to the page where the first note was kept. Still folded, still along the original creases. "Your leg will be fine, Garrett." He placed it on the table next to Garrett's letters. They all looked at the papers for a moment. Then Thomas said in the careful English he had been practicing since he understood this trip was coming, "I have wanted to understand this for my whole life. Not just what happened, why it worked, why that moment worked when words did not." Garrett thought about it. He said, "I think it worked because I did not try to argue him out of what he believed." You cannot argue a person out of something they have lived inside for years. The belief is not a conclusion. It is a room. You have to show them a door and let them choose to walk through it. Thomas said, "And the arm was the door." Garrett said, "The arm was the door." Felix was looking out the window at the Nashville afternoon, at the ordinary light on ordinary trees, at the particular piece of a neighborhood where nothing is currently on fire and no one is currently afraid. He said quietly, "I have tried to explain this to people. What it is like to be shown a door inside a room you did not know was a room. It is not like being convinced. Convincing happens outside you in the argument. This happened inside. It is more like waking up. You are not persuaded that the world is different. You open your eyes and see that it always was." No one spoke for a moment. Outside, a bird was doing something complicated in the trees. Anna's voice came from the kitchen, saying something to Margaret, and Margaret laughed, and the sound of it moved through the house, the way the sound of laughter moves through a house when the people inside it are not afraid of anything in particular, and the afternoon has a long way left to go. Thomas looked at his father, looked at Garrett, looked at the papers on the table, the old notes, the worn Bible, the small accumulated evidence of a correspondence that had lasted longer than some marriages and meant more than most. He said, "I want to be a doctor because of this story." Garrett looked at him. He said, "Then when you are a doctor and a patient is afraid of something that is trying to help them, remember that words are sometimes the wrong tool. Remember that the body believes what it sees. Show them the truth if you can, in whatever form the truth can take." Thomas nodded. Garrett reached for the small brown bottle on the table. He uncapped it. He turned his arm over the same forearm older, now the skin looser, the veins more visible. a 74-year-old doctor's arm with 40 more years of work on it than the last time. He held it out. He poured. The liquid ran across his skin, clear, unhurried, without drama. It reached the edge of his wrist and dropped onto the table, and he let it, not moving, just holding his arm there in the afternoon light, while the liquid did what it did, which was nothing to healthy skin, which was everything to an infection, which was exactly what it had always been. Thomas watched. Felix watched. And in the watching was something that cannot be manufactured or installed or broadcast over a radio or drilled into a boy in 3 days before sending him into a frozen road with a rifle he does not know how to use. It can only be received. It can only happen when a person looks at something real and allows it to be real, allows it to mean what it means, allows the room to have a door, and then steps through. The foam, when it came, would only come to what needed healing. That was all it had ever done. That was all any of it had ever done.